So hello and welcome back to BIO160. This will be your first lecture for the course, BIO160, an Introduction to Human Anatomy and Physiology. And this first lecture is kind of a slow, kind of start. We're going to do a little bit of review material from probably some of your previous biology courses, but again, it's still an important lecture to get you started for the rest of the lectures for the rest of the semester here. So again, I'm going to go ahead and get myself all set up here. You'll see that just like I talked about in the introduction, I will write on the slides and annotate the slides as we go through them, and that way then again you'll have all of that information just as if we were again lecturing and I had you in the classroom with me. So first off, we're going to talk a little bit about just some definitions, simply what is anatomy, what is physiology. Kind of important, since this is a course on anatomy and physiology, to know what those terms mean. So when we talk about the term anatomy, straight anatomy is literally just the study of the body part structure, or what we call morphology. So again, this would be the kind of study of the physical structure of different parts of the body. And then when we talk about physiology is actually the study of how that particular body part functions. And when we talk about anatomy and physiology, really it's very difficult for us to talk about the anatomy without talking about some of the physiology. When we talk about some of these different anatomical parts and what they look like, it's very difficult not to talk about how they function as well, because oftentimes the form or the, again, structure of that body part actually fits its function. So, for example, you're going to see that later on in the semester, we're going to talk about the intestinal lining. And when we talk about the intestinal lining, we're going to talk about the fact that instead of just being this kind of tube lined by this straight membrane, we're going to talk about the fact that instead it's a tube lined with this membrane that has all these finger-like structures. And again, that's basically the anatomy of it, that it has these finger-like structures that are called villi. And so these, again, would be the villi. And the function of having those finger-like structures is actually to increase or maximize surface area for absorption of nutrients across the intestinal lining. So we get a lot more surface area out of having this kind of folded finger-like appearance than we do having just a straight membrane. So again, we're going to talk a lot about how our form or anatomy actually fits its overall function. And so that'll be kind of an overall theme that you're going to see throughout the course. So now, before we kind of begin our more detailed study of anatomy and physiology, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of go back and review some of the traits that humans share with other organisms, particularly animals. And so one of the things that we're going to talk about is what defines a living organism, or what is the definition of life. So what are those characteristics that a living organism requires? And so I put up here the slide of Justice Potter Stewart, who is a Supreme Court Justice Judge, and unfortunately used the answer, and not in reference to what the question, what is life, but in reference to a question about a court case that had to do with, believe it or not, hardcore pornography. And his answer was that the video in question was not hardcore pornography, because he knew it when he saw it, and that was not it. And so just like that line didn't work for Justice Potter Stewart, as you can imagine, and unfortunately he did go down in history for that line. But just like that line didn't work for Justice Potter Stewart for that question, obviously then that line doesn't work for us in terms of our question about what is life. So when we talk about life and living organisms, again, have these characteristics. All living organisms will have these characteristics in common. And again, to be defined as a living organism, we have to have these characteristics. So kind of some of the essential functions for a living organism would be, one, that an organism has to have or exhibit movement. Now this movement can be like the big movements like you may think of when we're talking about actually, walking and moving in that manner, or we could even talk about the fact that cells themselves move. So cells have the ability to move with cilia and flagella, and then even inside a cell, we're going to talk about these things called organelles. And even inside a cell, we can have movement within that cell as these organelles we'll talk about will actually move inside that cell. So again, that's an essential function for all living organisms. Even if you're a single-celled organism, you have to have the ability to have some type of movement, even if it's just the stuff that's inside your cell. The next essential function is what we call responsiveness. And this is literally an organism's ability to respond to changes maybe in its internal or external environment. So for us, again, we'll talk a lot about responsiveness when we talk about our changes that we may have in the external environment, such as temperature, and how our body responds to those changes to help maintain what we're going to call homeostasis, or a state of sameness. So again, we have to have, as a living organism, we have to have the ability to respond to internal and external changes. We also have to have the ability to grow. So again, this can mean growth again as a multicellular organism like we are, or this can mean just again an individual cell that may again grow and develop. And along with that, when we talk about development, then of course we like to talk about reproduction. So reproduction is the ability again of a cell to be able to, again, produce either a copy of itself, or again, when we talk about reproduction, oftentimes with higher organisms, higher animals, and obviously we are an example of those, then we talk about sexual reproduction. So again, we'll talk a bit about that throughout the semester, especially as we get towards the end of the semester. So again, organisms have to have the ability to reproduce. They have to have the ability to do what's called respiration. And respiration is going to mean something a little bit different here than probably what you think of. Respiration here means what we call cellular respiration. So this should say, if I can write here, you're going to have to excuse me as I get used to writing with my mouse here. This is cellular respiration. If you can't read my horrible cursive there, it's cellular. So when we're talking about respiration here, this is cellular respiration, which is basically the ability for organisms to be able to process, again, food and energy, and use that energy then to run the cell. So when we talk about this process, we're actually going to talk about cellular respiration in a future lecture, but we are talking about this ability to do metabolism, this ability to be able to process and use energy. So of course then, organisms have to have the ability to do digestion, and digestion again would be to be able to break down materials into smaller parts. They have to have the ability to do absorption of again nutrients and water. And they have to be able to, once they absorb these nutrients or absorb water, they have to be able to circulate and move that water or move those nutrients to areas of the body or areas of the cell that need it. They have to have the ability to do what's called assimilation, to be able to, again, take in things that they need, assimilate things that they need from the external environment. And they also have to have the ability to excrete wastes, so to get rid of any waste products. So all of these processes actually involve what we call metabolism. Metabolism would be the sum total of our ability to do our building reactions and our breakdown reactions. And again, the reactions of metabolism actually enable us to acquire and use energy to fuel all of these life processes. So again, these are kind of our major again functions for, or basic requirements for, living organisms. So of course I decided to put up some funny non-living organisms, which appear zombies, or some of you may argue that zombies are living, but again just thought I would give you an example of the non-living and then of course the living. So keep in mind that when we look at living organisms can come as single-celled organisms. So again, living organisms can come as bacteria and fungus, and so again we share all of these essential functions where even these very simple organisms, such as bacteria that often cause, can cause disease for us. So when we talk about, again, these requirements, when we talked about the essential functions for life, we also have requirements for life, meaning that there are certain things that all living organisms are going to require. And so one of those is, of course, what my picture is of here, is that all living organisms are going to require water. Water is, especially humans, the most abundant chemical in our body, and it's required for many of our metabolic processes. It's used to transport substances in the body. It's important for regulating temperature, so we're going to talk a lot about how water is important for the body. Of course, food, I'm not sure why it's got a little delay here. That's supposed to say foods. So I'm not sure why my O's didn't show up, but I'm just going to draw them in there for you. So again, foods or nutrients and chemicals are obviously important because they're required for energy, but they're also going to provide kind of the raw materials for building new and living matter. Oxygen. So all organisms, again, are going to require, I shouldn't say all, because there are a few organisms actually that have the ability to use other gases like sulfides and hydrogen sulfides instead of oxygen. But most living organisms are going to require oxygen, and of course we are one of those organisms that requires oxygen, and that's because we're going to use this oxygen to actually release energy from our food. So oxygen is a very important requirement for us. Heat, again, is basically a product of all of our metabolic reactions. So heat is important because it actually will determine the rate at which our chemical reactions will occur. And so this is a requirement for living things, in that our chemical reactions and the rate at which they occur is determined by heat. And that can obviously have an impact on what range of temperature in which we can range in, or which we can survive within. And then pressure. Again, pressure is just the application of a force to something. So, for example, again, we're going to talk quite a bit about how important atmospheric pressure is in terms of breathing for us. We're also going to talk about the fact that as the heart, again, pumps every day, it produces pressure in the form of what we call hydrostatic pressure, this pressure which forces the blood through the blood vessels. So again, pressure is a very important requirement for us, and we'll talk a lot about throughout the semester how pressure is important for us. All right, so now, we're going to talk a little bit about, we're going to kind of leave some of these basic requirements for living organisms behind, and we're going to talk a little bit about something that is going to be really the theme of almost every chapter from here on out. And this is something called homeostasis. So when we talked about all the requirements for living organisms, we're going to talk about the fact that the quantities of those requirements are oftentimes maintained at a steady state. And this is important, again, especially when we talk about human anatomy and physiology. And so this steady state, or state of sameness, is what we call homeostasis. And literally the term homeostasis means state of sameness. So again, we're going to talk about the fact that throughout the semester, when we talk about each of these different body systems, we're going to talk about these different body systems and how much of your physiology is going to be how much of the energy within your body is going to be put towards maintaining homeostasis. And again, formal definition for homeostasis is just the maintenance of a stable internal condition. So, an example of this would be the fact that your body wants to maintain certain oxygen levels within the blood all the time. And so, again, your body, your respiratory system will adjust for that, and as well as your cardiovascular system, to maintain those oxygen levels at a certain level. Same thing with temperature, your body temperature again, and that's what this is kind of showing you an example of, is that much kind of like having a thermostat, your body has its own internal thermostat, and whenever, again, and it's got a certain set point, and we'll actually talk about the central nervous system, and even we'll eventually get into the fact that the hypothalamus controls your actual body set point for temperature. And so what happens is, if for some reason your body veers from that set point, let's say, you're sitting in a cold room and all of a sudden you start to get very cold, okay, and your body temperature starts to drop, then what will happen is this will trigger certain responses that will actually release heat. So you might start to speed up your metabolism a little bit, and as you start to speed up your metabolism, that's going to release heat as a byproduct. If you're really cold, you might start to shiver, and that muscular contraction that occurs when you shiver will actually release heat as well. And so again, bringing your body temperature back up to its normal set point. Now, if for some reason your body temperature raises too high, then you might start sweating, okay, to help cool yourself through evaporative cooling. And that would, again, bring your body temperature back to its normal set point. So again, this is what we're talking about when we're talking about homeostasis. It's just maintaining this state of sameness, maintaining, a certain body temperature, maintaining a certain blood glucose level, or maintaining certain blood oxygen levels. And you're going to see, again, this is going to be a big theme throughout the semester, so you're going to hear lots about homeostasis. And we can also talk about, again, when we're talking about homeostasis, there are some major components of our homeostatic systems. So the first major part, okay, of a homeostatic system is that we have to have some type of control center that maintains that set point. And as you can guess, again, our central nervous system, especially the brain, has a big role in this. And then we'll also talk about the fact that we have the endocrine system, and the endocrine system also acts along with the nervous system as a control center. And again, we'll get into the endocrine system later on in the semester. I just like to introduce that term now. The endocrine system is the system that produces hormones, these chemical signals that will be used again to kind of chemical messengers that will be used to tell the body what to do. So again, those are those are two systems that will act as your control center: is the nervous system, as well as the endocrine system. And then our next part of a homeostatic system is a receptor or a sensor. So we have to have some type of receptor or sensor to be able to detect any type of change that we may have that takes us away from homeostasis. So again, we'll talk about some of these different receptors and sensors in the body. And again, this is mostly our kind of peripheral nervous system that we'll talk about later on in the semester. And then the last part is we have to have what's called an effector. And this is basically what's going to cause a response to that altered condition that we have in the internal environment. So for example, when you were cold, okay, your effector would have been your muscles that were contracting when you were shivering, okay, to help bring your body temperature back up to its normal set point. So again, those are the three basic components. You have to have a control center that maintains that, again, homeostatic point, that set point. You have to have some type of receptor out there in the body that's detecting these changes that might occur in the internal environment that are taking you away from homeostasis. And then you have to have an effector. And basically that's the part of the body that's going to respond to that altered condition in your internal environment. So now, when we talk about homeostatic mechanisms, there are two major feedback mechanisms, or responses, I should say, again, in terms of if we have a change or we veer from homeostasis. And the most common one is going to be negative feedback mechanisms. Negative feedback mechanisms are going to be most of what we're going to talk about throughout the rest of the semester. Most of the feedback systems are going to be negative feedback systems. There are very few cases of positive feedback systems. So again, negative feedback will be the big one. And negative feedback systems are where we have an initial change in one direction. So let's say this is our homeostasis, right? And so if we have an initial change away from homeostasis, okay, our response in a negative feedback mechanism will bring us back to homeostasis, okay? So basically, negative feedback mechanisms are going to oppose an initial change. They're going to go in the opposite or negative direction from that initial change. And this helps us to maintain homeostasis. So again, just like always, in a feedback system, because this is a homeostatic mechanism, we will have a sensor that monitors the magnitude of that change, the control center that will compare the sensor's inputs with the actual set point, and then of course an effector that is going to make a response to that change to produce a desired effect. So let's go through an example of a negative feedback mechanism. Okay, again, and this is a good example of a negative feedback mechanism. So here in this first case, okay, we have a fall in body temperature, right? And this is kind of the example I've already given. A fall in body temperature, okay, below its actual set point. And the temperature monitoring nerve cells, okay, are going to be our sensors. We do have these temperature monitoring nerve cells that are going to detect that fall in body temperature. And so they're going to send that information, again, back to the brain, to the control center, where a decision will be made to send information out to our effectors, the skeletal muscles, and basically we'll tell those skeletal muscles to, again, release heat, and they're going to do that through shivering. So we'll actually get heat production through shivering. And so those effectors, okay, will then release heat, thereby increasing our body temperature back to its set point. Okay. So again, this is a negative feedback. We had an initial change away from homeostasis, and then again our effectors brought us back to our response brought us back to homeostasis, or that state of sameness. Another good example of a negative feedback mechanism is, of course, your blood glucose levels. So this is always kind of a fun one. You know, if you just ate dinner, you just ate maybe your Big Mac hamburger. Not sure why they chose that, but you know, you got your Big Mac hamburger there, let's say, and directly after you ate your, lovely Big Mac hamburger, your blood glucose levels, okay, rose. And so as your blood glucose levels rose away from homeostasis, of course, again, you have sensors out there that are going to detect those high blood glucose levels and send that information back to the brain, to the control center, which will send information again out to our effector, and our effector in this case would be the pancreas. And the pancreas will actually release some insulin secreting cells, insulin secreting. They'll release insulin. There are insulin secreting cells inside the pancreas, and they will release insulin. As that insulin travels through the bloodstream, it's going to basically cause liver cells and muscle cells to take up more of that glucose and store it in their cells as glycogen. So it's going to take the glucose out of the blood into the cells and store it as glycogen. And as it does that, okay, as it takes that glucose out of the blood, it restores our blood glucose levels back to their normal level, again, to their normal homeostatic level. So again, another example of negative feedback. We veered away from our normal set point, and of course our response took us right back. So now let's talk about what positive feedback is, because this is the, again, more kind of rare case, right? We don't see as many examples of positive feedback. So positive feedback is where we actually amplify an initial change. So what that means is we have a change in one direction, and our response, okay, to that change takes us even further away from homeostasis in that same direction. Okay, so this is where again an output is enhanced, and in this case we are moving in the direction of our initial change. So again, there are fewer examples of this, and I always tell my students, especially now, as you all probably know by now, that I am currently pregnant. A perfect example of this would be during the birth of a baby. Of course, I am in a state where I don't want to be pregnant forever, so I don't want to maintain homeostasis forever with being pregnant here. So thank goodness for the positive feedback mechanism of childbirth. So the example in this case is that as the baby moves during labor, as the baby moves down the birth canal, again, in its initial change here, then it's going to, as it moves into the cervix, this stimulates uterine contractions. As the mother's uterus contracts, it's going to push the baby even further down in the cervix, or further down in the birth control, or the birth canal. No birth control at that point. We're beyond that, right? So we're going to push the baby even further down the birth canal, causing even more intense uterine contractions, causing the baby to move even farther down the birth canal. So again, you can see that our initial change, the baby actually moving down the birth canal, then is followed by a response, the uterine contractions, that take us even further in that direction. And again, that's an example of positive feedback. So again, like I talked about, there's very few examples of positive feedback. We have a couple of other examples, such as in blood clotting. We have certain chemicals that carry out clotting that are going to stimulate more clotting to minimize bleeding, but these are usually very short-term type positive feedback cycles. So again, really most of the feedback mechanisms that you're going to see are going to be negative feedback mechanisms, because for the most part we usually want to maintain homeostasis. So just a couple of examples for you to go through at home. The first example I'm going to read off for you is that a female becomes amenorrheic, which means she stops her menstrual cycle. And this can oftentimes happen. You'll see this especially in anorexic teenagers. And the reason for this is that their body literally becomes deprived of food and energy reserves. So menstruation is actually, again, a huge energy expense. So to focus on her body energy stores, as she, again, has deprived her body of food, okay, so her energy levels, again, are driving away from homeostasis. If she were to menstruate, then that would deplete her energy stores even more, which would be, again, more positive feedback. But instead, okay, her body chooses, again, her body stops menstruation, she becomes amenorrheic. So this, again, allows her to, again, basically hold on to those energy stores to try to help maintain homeostasis. So in this case, this is actually a negative feedback mechanism. Again, she's trying to maintain her energy stores to be constant. So here's another nice example, and again, you're going to tell me positive or negative feedback. So I'm going to describe it and hopefully give you a little time to, at home, to figure out whether or not it's positive or negative feedback, and then I'll give you the actual answer. So in this case, a runner breathes more heavily when exercising, so focus on the oxygen content of the blood. So again, in this case, here's our homeostasis. And as that runner is, again, contracting those leg muscles, right? And as they're contracting those leg muscles, those muscle cells themselves are going to require oxygen, so they're going to take up more oxygen. As they do, our blood oxygen levels are going to drop as that oxygen is moved to feed those muscle cells. So what do? We breathe heavier. We breathe heavier to bring more oxygen back into the blood to bring us back up to our normal blood oxygen levels, or homeostasis. So hopefully you figured out by now that this is another example of negative feedback. So again, I'm just going to put an N here for both of these being negative feedback. Oops, I'm sorry, I drew on some of the lower question or the lower example here, but the last one is actually not an anatomy example, but again, and so you can probably guess as to which one this is, and that's because there's not as many examples of this type of mechanism in the human body. But here you can see in this case, lower unemployment causes increased labor costs, which raise the prices on goods. So again, we raise the price on goods, causing inflation, okay, which would be our response, which causes wages to increase even more, which leads to even more inflation. So again, we can see that we've got a change, again, an initial change that causes basically our response, and our response brings us even further in that direction of that change. So, of course, this is a positive feedback mechanism. So, and again, if you have any questions on the differences between positive and negative feedback, please feel free to come, ask me questions in my online office hours, or you're welcome to send me questions via Gmail to my Gmail account. But that's an important concept. It's important for you to understand the difference between negative and positive feedback, because we're going to talk a lot about negative feedback mechanisms this semester. So for the next little bit of this lecture, we're just going to talk real briefly about how the body is kind of structurally organized. And after that, we're going to get into a little bit of our kind of anatomical terminology. So this is where we'll kind of veer more into the human anatomy here. So the body is actually structurally organized into these different levels, these hierarchical levels. And so at the very smallest, okay, of these levels, we can break the body down into its most basic parts, the atoms. So the atoms, again, that are going to make up our cells or make up the molecules of our cells. So again, this would be things like carbon atoms and oxygen atoms and hydrogen and nitrogen atoms that are going to make up the molecules, which is our next level of organization here, that then make up the organelles that will make up our cells. So again, an example of an atom would be, we have, let's say, a hydrogen atom, okay? And so, and maybe we have an oxygen atom, okay? And if we take two of those hydrogen atoms and we put them together with an oxygen atom and they bond together, then we formed a molecule. Okay, so a molecule is when we put two or more, again, atoms of different elements together. So you'll see that again in water there. And then, again, we can put all of these molecules together, all of these different molecules of life. And we're going to talk about these major macromolecules of life in the next chapter for chemistry. But when we put these macromolecules together, we can actually form what's called organelles. And organelles are what I like to call the organs of a cell, or organs inside a cell. So these are going to be things like your mitochondria, or your nucleus, or your endoplasmic reticulum. These are going to be the organelles inside one single cell. And so, of course, when we put all of those organelles together, functioning together, they're going to make up the cell. And then, when we take, again, a group of cells and we put them close together, and those group of cells are actually working together for a common function, then those cells have made up a tissue layer. So again, tissues are just when we have a group of specialized cells that are working together for a common function. And then we can take different tissue layers, and when those different tissue layers are again all working together for a common function, they can make up an organ. So, for example, your stomach, isn't just one tissue layer. It's made up of epithelial tissue that lines it. It's made up of muscle tissue, and we're actually going to talk about that when we get to the digestive system. So again, we talk about these organs. Organs are actually tissues, oftentimes many tissues, working together for that common function. And then, of course, we can put organs together that work for a common function. So, for example, and these would make up our organ systems. So, for example, when we talk about the digestive system consists of many organs that are working together for this common function. So, for example, again, it's not just your stomach, but your intestines, your pancreas, your liver, your gallbladder, all are working together for this common function of digestion. And so again, we'll talk a lot about the different body systems, and actually I have a slide here to talk about some of these different body systems here in just a minute. And then, of course, when we talk about all of our organ systems working together, will function together to make up the whole organism. So again, this is our structural organization or hierarchy. So you should make sure you know, again, this structural organization, that atoms make up molecules, and they put in here and make up macromolecules. Again, we're going to talk more about this more in the chemistry chapter here that we're going to be getting into. But so those molecules make up organelles. Organelles working together make up cells. Cells that are functioning together for a specialized function make up tissues. Tissues, again, specialized tissues functioning together for a common function make up organs. Organs working together for a common function make up organ systems. And of course, again, all those organ systems working together make up the whole organism. So let's talk about the different organ systems. So we just briefly, again, mentioned that we have all of these different organ systems that are going to be functioning together to make up the human body or the human organism as a whole. And so it's important that you understand just real briefly what these organ systems are and what their major functions are, how they contribute really to homeostasis in the human body, which is the ultimate goal of all of these different organ systems. So our first organ system is the circulatory system, and this is a very important system for transporting materials, so especially transporting gases such as oxygen and carbon dioxide, but also transporting nutrients and water. So our next system is the digestive system, and the digestive system, of course, is important for breaking down food that we take in into smaller nutrient molecules. So eventually, again, that food can be absorbed. The respiratory system is important for actually obtaining oxygen and getting rid of this waste product, carbon dioxide. So again, the respiratory system is marked with that major function. So again, respiratory system obtains the oxygen into the blood system, and then the circulatory system will transport it from there. Urinary system, very important again for removing and eliminating waste, especially our protein waste from breaking down proteins from the plasma. The skeletal system is very important for providing support and protection for our soft tissues. It's one of its major functions. Well, let's talk about the fact that it helps us maintain things like blood calcium levels. But again, its major function is, again, providing that support and protection for our soft tissues. Muscular system, of course, very important for movement. So our muscular system is what moves our bones. Our integumentary system, again, which is basically going to be our outer protective barrier, mostly the skin, is again going to serve that function as providing protection. It acts as an outer protective barrier. The immune system, of course, it is going to be designed to defend against any type of foreign invader, whether it be bacterial, whether it be a virus. So again, our immune system helps to defend against foreign substances. The nervous system, of course, very important. We already talked about this in terms of our homeostatic mechanisms as acting as a control center. It also helps to coordinate activities. The endocrine system, again, also helps to work as a control center for many of our homeostatic mechanisms. And it does this through regulating certain activities that usually, again, the endocrine system's dedicated to regulating activities that have a certain time period on them, that require a certain duration. So this is going to include basically, our endocrine system will include all of our glands that are going to secrete hormones. And then, of course, there's the good old reproductive system, which is very important for continuing the species, right? We couldn't continue the human species if we didn't have reproductive systems. So kind of an important one. All right, so the last bit of this lecture, it will be again more anatomical organization and orientation. So in this slide, we're going to talk about some of the major body cavities. So you're going to see here, we have these major body cavities, and actually you're going to do a lab that will kind of walk you through some of this as well. So we have the dorsal body cavities, and dorsal, as you're going to learn, this means towards the back side. So our dorsal, or towards the back side cavities, are going to be the cranial cavity, okay, again, which, as you can guess, is going to house the brain, and then also the vertebral cavity. So again, cranial cavity along with the vertebral cavity here. And of course, the vertebral cavity is going to house, as you can guess, the spinal cord. So then we have our ventral body cavities, and our ventral body cavities are going to be these body cavities that are more towards the front side of the body. And so this is going to be the thoracic cavity here, which is going to, of course, house the heart and lungs. And then we have the what's called the abdominopelvic cavity, okay? And the abdominopelvic cavity is a combination of the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity together. And the pelvic cavity is going to contain the urinary bladder and the reproductive organs, where the abdominal cavity will house the rest of the organs. So things like the stomach and the pancreas and the liver and the intestines. And then we can have some of these smaller cavities within the head that we're going to talk about a little later on in the semester. So we'll talk about the oral cavity, the nasal cavity, the orbital cavity, the middle ear. So again, we'll get to those a little bit later on in the semester. So again, this is just kind of a review of some of these cavities. Now, we're going to talk about we'll get into the fact that we can break down the thoracic cavity here into these different smaller cavities that are going to be these double membranes that surround certain organs. So we'll talk about the pleural cavity in a minute here, the pericardial cavity, and the abdominopelvic cavity here. And so again, when we were talking about some of these other cavities, these cavities are going to be created basically by membranes, body membranes. And we have these specialized body membranes. They're literally these double membranes that help to protect certain organs that are going to be moving a lot. Organs that are going to be contracting a lot and be creating friction as they move. So we're going to have these nice little gelatinous sacs around things like the heart and the lungs that are constantly moving to help prevent friction, basically, from building up as that organ moves inside that cavity. So if you look here, we have a couple different membranes. We're going to talk about the pericardial membrane and the pleural membranes. The pericardial membrane is going to be this double layer sac that we see here surrounding the heart. And the pleural membranes is going to be this double membrane sac that we see surrounding the lungs. So again, pleural refers to the sac surrounding the lungs. I'm going to attempt to write in here. And the pericardial sac is going to surround the heart. And So when we talk about both of, and sorry again, I'm not sure why it's leaving out that's parietal there. When we talk about either the pericardial sac or the pleural sacs that surround the lungs, again, these are actual membranes. And what ends up happening is these membranes actually are filled with fluid and are folded back on themselves. So the membrane actually is not just one layer, but then it folds back on itself just like this, okay, to surround that organ. And inside, okay, would be, again, the organs such as the heart inside here. So here would be the heart. So why do we have these double sacs? And this is a really nice example of that as well. If you can see here, if you were to take your fist, which would represent the heart, and you were to shove it inside a balloon, you would see that, again, you'd have this inner layer that directly surrounds your fist and then this outer layer. And instead of air, okay, being inside that sac, instead, we're going to have this fluid, this nice gelatinous fluid called serous fluid. So inside here, we have serous fluid. So when we're talking about the pericardial sac, we actually call the space in between here, okay, that's filled with that serous fluid, the pericardial cavity, okay? And again, I didn't name it. I don't like the term cavity because it makes you think that it's empty, and it's not. It's filled with this gelatinous fluid. And so for, again, any type of sac like this, we're going to have an inner membrane that directly lines the organ, and then where the membrane folds back on itself, okay? So the inner lining right here, okay, that would directly line the heart here, we actually call the visceral lining. So, or visceral in this case because it's the heart, visceral pericardium. So here, okay, if this, again, your fist were the heart, this would be the visceral pericardium. And then the outer layer, where it folds back on itself here, this outer layer is actually called the parietal layer, okay, or parietal pericardium. So again, in my case of the drawing here, okay, this inner membrane directly surrounding the heart is the visceral lining, and the outer lining here is the parietal lining. Now, again, if you know what viscera means, viscera literally means organ. So it makes sense for this inner layer that's going to directly surround the organ for it to be called the visceral layer. And to help you remember that, I have a kind of funny story. I was working with some students in the lab, and they were asking me if I like to eat snails, escargot, and because I teach marine biology, and I said no, I don't particularly like escargot, and the reason being is that inside the snail they still have all of the organs, and I don't like to eat visceral mass, so I am not a particular connoisseur of visceral mass. So anyway, hopefully that little story will help you to remember that visceral means organs. So again, just like the pericardium, here we have for the pleural membranes, inside the inner membrane here, okay, again, is going to be called the visceral pleura. So that's the inner layer, right? Then where this membrane folds back on itself, okay, that layer that's farther away from the lungs themselves is called the parietal pleura. So again, this outer layer is the parietal pleura. And then the space in between the visceral and the parietal pleura here, so the space in between here that's filled with that watery serous fluid is called the pleural cavity. And so the last, again, specific membrane that you're going to see that's a double membrane like this, and again, it's not drawn in here, is what we call the peritoneal cavity. And the peritoneal cavity is going to basically be this double membrane that surrounds our, oh, that was horrible, sorry, abdominal organs. So, and I'm sorry, you're going to have to excuse me as I get used to writing with my mouse. This is awful. But again, if you can read that, that says abdominal. So again, the peritoneal cavity is going to surround, this is going to be that double membrane that surrounds the abdominal organs. All right, so I think the last thing that we have is some anatomical terminology. So we're going to talk about anatomical positions and relative positions. So if we are talking about, okay, two positions, again, relative to each other. Oh, and real quick, anatomical position, sorry. When we talk about anatomical position, I'm actually just going to move forward here real quick so you can see anatomical position. I normally demonstrate this, for a class. Sorry about that. I normally demonstrate this on myself, but obviously this is a little more difficult for me to do for you. So I'm going to go ahead and show you what anatomical position looks like. This woman is in anatomical position right here. If you look here, she has her palms facing forward, and you need to have, again, your palms facing forward to be in anatomical position. So this position here, again, head facing forward, palms facing forward, in a standing position would be anatomical position. And anytime we make a reference of one body part in comparison to another body part, we are always going to be doing it from anatomical position. So let's talk about some relative positions. So when we're talking about, again, one body part relative to another body part. So if we are talking about one body part that is above another body part, meaning it's closer to the head, then we're going to use the term superior. So for example, your nose is going to be superior to your mouth. Okay? And then just the opposite, obviously, would be inferior. So inferior would be closer again towards the feet. So if we were talking about the mouth is inferior to your nose. We'll also use the terms anterior and posterior. These can also, again, be used alongside of ventral and dorsal. So posterior is going to mean towards your backside. Okay? Anterior will mean toward the front side. So anytime that we're referring to an anatomical part that's closer to the back, we'll say it's more posterior. That's closer to the front, it's more anterior. Medial and lateral. Okay, so if you could draw again a line right down the middle of the body, okay, medial would be towards the midline. So anytime that we're referring to something that's closer to the midline, we're going to say it's more medial. And anytime it's farther away from the midline, it's more lateral. And then proximal and distal would be proximal and distal will be two other common terms. Proximal and distal are usually used with the limbs, and they're going to be used to describe a body part that's either closer to the attachment of the trunk or farther from the attachment of the trunk. So again, we're mainly going to use proximal and distal mainly on your limbs. So if something is more proximal, that means it's closer to the trunk of the body. And if it's more distal, it's more distant or farther away from the trunk of the body. So for example, your wrist is going to be more distal than your elbow. Okay? And your elbow, being closer to the trunk of the body, is more proximal than your wrist is. And then the last two terms that we use are superficial and deep. So obviously superficial is going to be more towards the outer layer, and deep would be more towards the inner layer. So outer layer being, again, like the outer layer of your skin, that's more superficial. Deep would be, again, farther away from that layer. A couple other different anatomical terms that we're going to use. We're going to use these different planes or sections through the body, and this is oftentimes because we'll actually look at, and if you've ever done like the Body World exhibit, you've seen some of these sections where they've actually taken they've actually taken whole human cadavers and actually sectioned them sagittally, transversely, and done coronal sections. Really, really pretty neat. So if you haven't seen the Body Work show with the plastinated specimens, I highly suggest you do it the next time it's in town. It's an amazing, amazing show. But anyway, so we've got these different planes or sections that we can do. What we call sagittal plane, okay, is where we're going to section lengthwise, do a lengthwise section or plane through the body, and this will actually divide the body into left and right halves. So this is what we call a mid-sagittal section because it's right down the midline. But you can do a sagittal section that, again, maybe is off the midline there as well. Okay, and that would still be a sagittal section. As long as it breaks the body into left and right halves or left and right parts, then it's a sagittal section. A transverse section, as you can see here, transverse section is actually going to break the body into superior and inferior parts. So again, that's your transverse planar section. And again, that transverse plane can be anywhere. It doesn't have to be a mid-transverse plane here. And it just has to separate the body into superior and inferior halves. And then our last one is what we call the coronal plane, which actually divides the body into anterior and posterior parts. So here's your coronal section, dividing the body into the anterior front part and posterior back part. So we call that a coronal section. So I think that's it for today's lecture. If you have any questions or, again, you're confused on any of these different terms, please feel free to contact me again via email at kryaperry@gmail.com, or again, you can feel free to join me for my online office hours on Illuminate. Have a good night.